Christoph Hausmann, but please feel free to call me Chris. I'm a psychodynamic psychotherapist, and I'm located in Wiesbaden, which is kind of southern Germany, I guess. And I'm very honored to be here with Kat. Kat, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. I too am a psychological psychotherapist. That in Germany is like a strange construct. It technically just means that after having studied psychology, we do another kind of a degree, and then we become psychotherapists. I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist. Also a psychologist for future, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much for having us. And today we're going to speak about climate, mental health, and resilience in the era of climate change. Yes, so we like to use that quote from Mr. Paulsen: climate change is a psychological crisis, whatever else it is, because as long as humans are involved, there's always something psychological about things.
Yes. We want to get to know you some kind of, so we will give you a lot of information in this talk, but it shouldn't be exactly just be a lecture, but also we want to get into some kind of, like interaction with you. So you can either use the chat, which would be more anonymous, to ask us questions or something. And also later we will ask you maybe if you want to share some kind of personal stories. So we already informed you that this is going to be recorded, but possibly we will at the end also have the opportunity to turn the recording off completely. And so maybe you feel more free to share something personal, but maybe also you can share something in between that is not too personal and that you're okay with. We will see how this works out, and if you don't share any kind of information or ask us questions, then just Kat and me will do the job and ask ourselves, and it will be fun.
Yes. So, Chris, would you like to introduce us to
the agenda? You can possibly all read it. We're going to talk about mental health in general in the beginning. Which is kind of our profession, and but we will keep this very short, and then we will come to climate and its effects. And what is implied here is, of course, the effects on mental health. And in the biggest part of our lecture, we're going to talk about climate anxiety and resilience. So I think the title of this lecture was Climate Depression, which is not exactly the same thing as climate anxiety, but we're going to focus on anxiety because it's simply the most and best researched thing in 2020. But of course, anxiety is also related to depression and to other kind of, I will call them not illnesses at this point, but mental phenomenons. And yeah, we will also say something about other mental phenomenons. Yeah, and resilience is a very big part. So it's basically the question, what can we do to feel better, to cope better? Yeah.
So I'm going to take you into the field of mental health and how we actually define mental health or mental illness, because I think that's something that not everybody is so very informed about. So we use the Biopsychosocial Model to explain how mental health and mental illness or illness in any kind actually comes to be defined. So there's always different factors that create health or illness. And there's biological factors, there's social factors, and there's psychic factors. And in this model, we actually see humans as a body-mind unity, which is kind of also embedded in a social or cultural or ecological surrounding. And that also creates certain factors that can be risk factors for creating illnesses, but also can be protective factors that make us more resilient. So there's a multifactorial determination of health or illness. And actually, we wouldn't say that there's two categories of being either healthy or ill, but there's a continuum between these, and we're all situated somewhere on that line. So there's genetic factors or dispositions that could make us prone to becoming mentally ill or bodily ill. There's, of course, as we all know, with this pandemic, viruses and bacteria that can also be related to climate change, these zoonoses. Then there's, of course, injuries and damages that can make us ill. Then there's social factors like the socioeconomic status, the living conditions that we live in, working conditions, our ethnicity, experiences of discrimination of any kind, racism, that can make us feel bad. And then, of course, there's social networks and relationships that can be a factor in either being more resilient, but also a very strong factor in making us unhappy. And then there's, of course, these psychological factors, I would say. That's cognition, so the way we think, the attitudes that we have towards life, and the expectations that we have about life. And there's emotions, of course, feelings we have of different kind that can be kind of good feelings or feelings that are more like inconvenient, that we don't really like having. And then there's, of course, behavioral factors like, I don't know, smoking for lung cancer, but also about climate change, of course. So we can actually embed climate change as some kind of a biological factor, but also a social factor of some kind, which I'm going to explain later. So what does climate change do to us? First of all, we have all these phenomena of climate change. I'm not going to explain how climate change works. I guess you've already heard about that. And of course, it has different effects in our surroundings, which is air pollution, more severe weather events, extreme heat. Then there's environmental degradation, which can lead to forced migration, conflicts, water and food supply impacts, which can lead to malnutrition, impacted water quality, which can also lead to different kinds of other diseases, as well as increasing allergens, which is also bad for health. And then there's changes in the vector of ecology, which can lead to diseases like malaria and dengue, moving from the global south more towards the north and becoming more I don't know, becoming a bit of a problem here as well. Yeah. So there's different multiple effects that climate change can have on our body, but that also leads to a mental health impact. So how do we deal with these different factors that affect our physical health? Of course, these can also be challenging for us on a mental level. So we all know that it's kind of inconvenient to have allergies. It's inconvenient to feel ill on a bodily level, and we have to cope with that. But there's also more acute consequences of climate change, like the traumatic events of severe weather events. So how do we deal with these? So losing people you love, or being affected yourself, losing your home, all that is very challenging. So if we look into the science, then we see that after extreme weather events, we have 7 to 40% of people being affected on a psychological level. There's raising quotes of suicide, of anxiety, of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder after these events. And of course, these need to be tended to, and we need to cope with these things. And there's of course social factors that could help in a community coping with these multiple traumatizations that we have there. Then there's more like smaller effects of some, for example, heat waves. Heat is kind of challenging for our body. It can be too big, as we have seen in parts of India, for example, when we reach like 50 degrees of Celsius. That is very challenging for the body itself, but it's also challenging for us on our mental level, dealing with this kind of a stress. It can lead to being less able to cope with the challenges that everyday life gives us, being more aggressive, and that can then again kind of decrease other crises or conflicts that we have. Yes, and then we have different other ways of dealing with what climate change confronts us with, which could be forced migration, for example. Having lost your home can, first of all, be a challenge in itself, but it can also be challenging to kind of integrate into new societies, building up a new social network. That's all very challenging for people. So on the long run, climate change can in various ways lead to a loss of feelings of security, stability, and control, feeling that home is not a safe place anymore once you've experienced several events of extreme weather, or actually not having home anymore. Losing your home, using your place of security can be very challenging. But also being confronted with climate change as a trauma can be very challenging, as it makes, as there's research on trauma, and it's actually more challenging for people to cope with trauma that has been caused by humans. So man-made trauma is more challenging for us to deal with. And in climate change, it kind of is a mix between natural disaster trauma and also man-made trauma. So that can lead to losing a feeling of trust in humanity itself, in your surroundings. So we have a kind of a mixed trauma in climate change, and that is something that you have to deal with in therapy, then kind of regaining trust in humanity.
It's like a bit mean that you are like kind of traumatized by other human beings, but you cannot grab us like this person did that to me or something. It's like a twister, I think.
Yeah, I think that's also very hard actually to address that in therapy, that you don't actually have a person to blame, but that it's kind of this feeling that you can't really grab, that other people have caused this harm in you, but you can't actually point to someone and be angry with them. You have to be like kind of a strange way of angry with everybody and nobody. Like it's really bad. Yes, and of course there's grief, a lot of grief in climate change. Looking at the animals and the nature that we lose, losing your home once you have to move, losing maybe parts of your identity, which could be either belonging to a place that you have to move away from, but also losing jobs. When we transition our society, when we change the way we produce energy, people lose jobs. That's something that we have to cope with as a society and as a single person. But also looking at farmers, for example, working in Australia, we have high rates of depression and suicides in Australian farmers, because it's getting really hard to do farming in Australia. And of course you can change job, but you will lose your home and you will lose a part of your identity as having been a farmer, and then you have to kind of start anew and define yourself in a different way, and that's can be very challenging for people. So there's various effects that climate change can have in us. And how do we treat this? So there haven't been any like official diagnosis of climate-related diseases. That is because in these diagnostic manuals that we have, where all the diseases are listed, we don't actually define mental health based on the cause of the symptoms, but we kind of define mental health problems based on clusters of symptoms. So when we look into what is depression, it says that over a course of more than 2 weeks, for most of the days, you would have had feelings of sadness or feelingless or losing your
disorders, yeah.
self-esteem, feelings of guilt, whatever. So there's different definition or symptoms that can be part of depression, but it doesn't define whether you're depressed because you lost your job, or because your partner split up, or because of climate change. So
Basically
it
the
does.
same thing as your diagnosis is a broken leg, that your diagnosis is not, I don't know, fell out of the window or got hit by a car or something.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's true. This is why I guess that it would actually need a change of the way we define mental health or mental health issues, to actually include something like climate anxiety into these diagnostic manuals. And also, we could question whether actually feelings of anger or sadness or fear because of climate change as mental health problems or not, and we're going to get to that.
Yeah, so the topic is climate anxiety here. And the question is, what is that? So we heard that it's not really a diagnosis, because we don't really care about the causes. Of course we care, but we don't name it in the diagnosis. But it's basically a very well researched phenomenon at 2020. Well is maybe a bit overdone, but research is beginning to emerge. And so Kat said it early on, and I want to emphasize this very, very much, that when we're talking about anxiety in general, we're not trying to, I don't know, to say that everything is a kind of illness or something. So being anxious basically is, I don't know, evolutionary, very, very adaptive. Yeah. So if we as human race never felt anxiety, so we would already have gone extinct. So so when does anxiety become a problem? Of course, when you become dysfunctional in any kind of ways. So if you are so afraid of spiders that you cannot move anywhere around because there could be a spider, and in general we know that in Germany, for example, spiders are not dangerous. So it's kind of an irrational fear. But is fear of climate change irrational? Yeah, well, possibly it's very irrational to be afraid of climate change. So, for example, the American Psychological Association found that being more afraid of climate change, experiencing higher levels of climate anxiety, is related to more environmental friendly behavior. So it's a good thing. So be more afraid, and you will behave in a way that is more environmental friendly. Greatness. So, but the question is, how do we define climate anxiety? So there is another researcher, her name is Clayton. She's a professor of, I forgot it, of Worcester, of the University of Worcester, and she came up with the Clayton climate anxiety scale. And in that scale, she asked questions like, my anxiety about climate change, does it make hard for me to work to my full potential? Or I have trouble to get my school assignments or work assignments done because of my anxiety about climate change. And voila, if you ask these kinds of questions, there is no link between climate anxiety and environmentally friendly behavior. So it really comes up to the question, how do you define this? So if you define climate anxiety as a kind of also paralyzing fear, so the positive effects, they just vanish, So it really comes down to the question, how do we define this concept? And also I can give you some definitions of climate anxiety. For example, the American Psychological Association said it's a chronic fear of environmental doom. So it's, to me, this feels kind of big, environmental doom. We just yesterday gave a talk about climate communication and talked about the problem of doomism, which would be like everything is so doomed, So people get paralyzed or maybe even people get used to that kind of communication. So we're kind of fucked up anyway, so why should I care, you know? So this is not a very good way of communicating. Another definition, which was brought up by Albrecht, who was a pioneer of researching this, was non-specific worries. So worries are more like the cognitive aspect of fear. So worries are not exactly my sweaty hands, which is a part of fear, but worries are more in my head. Non-specific worries about our relationship to support environment. You see that this is a definition that I personally don't understand in the very beginning. I really have to think about it. Non-specific worries about our relationship to support environment. So this is what we talk about when we talk about climate anxiety. So there are other related concepts which you see here. So maybe you've heard about those and maybe you didn't. So we will just talk about some of them. For example, you see solastalgia in there. I don't know if you met that. How do you say that verb? Before. Katharina, can you explain the solastalgia? Because I'm not sure I can very good. I think it's defined as the homelessness that you experience, although your home is not already lost.
Yes, that's kind of a home sickness for a home that you're going to lose. So this is related to, yes, in the future. So this is related to research that was conducted on people or indigenous peoples living in the global north. So basically Inuit, for whom the ice is a very part of their identity and their way of life, and losing that ice, or actually kind of imagining losing that ice as a part of their home, can lead to feelings of solastalgia. So kind of a homesickness for a home that is to be lost.
It's in a way kind of lyrical expression, isn't it? Like, yeah. But also a lyrical concept for something that is entirely unlyrical. So there's also I think somewhere is the word like a guilt or shame. I don't see it right now, but I'm sure it's there. So we as Psychologists for Future, we also get requests by I don't know, by activists or by people just basically most of the time all over Germany. And they want to have consultations, maybe even therapy, but often just consultations about feelings such as eco-guilt, like they feel guilty of their consumption behavior or something, although maybe they can change something about it, maybe they can't even change something about it, but they feel guilty about it and ask for advice how to deal with their feelings of guilt. Yeah. Shame would be even a bit more like, guilt is usually a feeling that says I have done something wrong, and shame would be a feeling that says I am as a person wrong. You see that there are very, very many more concepts. Depression could also be like something that is related to my trouble about environmental doom. Yeah.
Actually, I could tell a little story about that. So I've talked to an activist. She was very young. She still went to school, and she was kind of, I would say, eco-depressed, really, because she looked at the way that our world is changing, and she was really involved in school strikes and trying to change everything. And after having been on the streets every Friday for about a year, she came to me and she said, like, I've been out there, I've done everything, I put all my resources in changing this problem, and it's so slow. Politicians are so slow, nothing's changing, we've lost. So kind of the downside of doomism, being too involved in all the doom that awaits us, can lead to feelings of like deep hopelessness. And then she said she actually had suicidal thoughts about having wasted her school exams and not being able to finish school because of all her activism, and then kind of getting into a dead-end street with her life because of climate change. So looking into a future that has nothing to offer, but also having like kind of sacrificed everything that could be good in between. So having a good job and everything. So that to me was a very alarming case. And
what
then
did you say? What did you say to her?
So I kind of questioned whether they actually reached nothing with the protest that they had, because having been a climate activist since 2009, so since the COP in Copenhagen, I do see a huge change in awareness around the climate issue. And compared to what happened in politics 20 years ago, we have seen a huge impact of that movement within the last year. I think the problem in this case really is that she was so young, and that she didn't have any experience with how fast or slow politics are moving normally.
Yeah.
And so she couldn't really compare.
Yeah.
And this really helped. So it's good to have like cross-generational conversations as well, and that leads to me to the next buzzword, which is eco-silence or climate silence, which is something that can be very challenging for people as well. So being worried about climate change and not being able to speak about it with anyone, because once you start a conversation about climate change, people kind of shut up and close up, and they're like, either they don't actually take it as serious as you do, or they don't want to talk about it because it's too dooming. It's like really a bad conversation topic. It kind of stops every kind of conversation. And that's climate silence, and that can lead you to a feeling of, I am the only one who cares, and that's like very much not true. Because looking into research, we see that for example, in Germany, 2/3 of young people actually care about climate change, and they're worried about climate change. So we are not alone, but we're just not. We haven't developed a culture of talking about these big issues yet, and that can be very challenging as well.
We're having a chat question, and I'm just going to ask it to you, Kat, so we will cheer things up a little bit. So it's a psychological newbie question. That's what the person is writing, not what I would say. Is the psychological model based on universal human traits, or are there many models applicable to different cultures? Like lawyers from different countries are all lawyers, but could not straightforwardly transfer to another country.
So yes, I think that's a problem in psychology, really, that most of the psychological research that we have today is based on westernized cultures. So we don't have many insights on cultural differences, especially cultures, indigenous cultures that are not based on westernized thinking. And I think also that there still is a huge lack of research on the difference between individualistic and collective cultures, as we see in Asia, East Asia. So yes, but looking into the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases by the World Health Organization, these are meant to be valid for everybody on this planet.
And I also think the biopsychosocial model should be applicable to all cultures, shouldn't it be? Like only there will be different weights, and like you say, in a collective culture, the social factor will be much more important. And in an individualist culture, like the psychological individual are implied to be more, I don't know, have more weight.
But I would actually question that.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah, but basically, it's yeah. You can ask questions in the chat if you like, and we will either answer them in between or at the end. We will just improvise. So just feel free to ask us questions, and especially later, feel free to turn on your videos and just ask us a question personally. But be aware that you might be recorded. Just now. Maybe we put the recording off later so you can feel more free. There's also like cultural dependent findings on climate anxiety, which I will just report very, very shortly. So it's basically a no-brainer. If you are hit by climate change in any ways, then you are likely to feel more climate anxiety. It's basically very, very supposed to be like that. But hit by climate change would mean either be hit by a traumatic, I don't know, by a traumatic, I don't know, wave or something that was induced by climate change and took your home. But it could also just mean caring very much about climate change, which would be activism. Yeah. So
Yes,
activists
and
are
we had a
basically
question about whether there's going to be more strategies to prevent getting frustrated about climate change. And yes, we're going to talk about individual resilience later on.
very much.
Stay tuned. But actually now I would like to invite you to a little imagination that we're going to do. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. And I see most of your cameras are turned off, and please feel free to keep your cameras turned off, because it's going to be a bit of an imagination. I'm going to answer the question that just came in later. So I would like to ask you to turn your cameras off and maybe just have a very comfortable position to be seated in. And if you like, you can close your eyes. If you don't like closing your eyes, you can just look at a little spot right in front of you and kind of make the vision blur a little, so don't focus too much. And maybe start by feeling the seat that you're sitting on, which parts of your body are in contact with that surface. And then focus on your breath, how it's flowing in and out of your body. Maybe you can feel it moving in your nostrils. And then I would like to invite you to welcome all feelings which will be coming up in this few brief moments of imagination that we're going to do. Try not to fight them, but just to welcome them for being there, experiencing them. And maybe you can now envision yourself standing on your lifeline. In front of you, there's your future. And in your back, there's your past. You're in this very, very moment right now, standing on this path of life. And then you could imagine traveling about 30 years to the future. And maybe there's someone with you. Maybe there's a child or a grandchild, depending on your age now. And you're probably going for a walk in a forest. And while walking through that forest with that child, which is holding your hand, you can see that all the trees are brown. The leaves are kind of dry and the air is very hot. And maybe you remember that forest from your childhood. You remember how it used to be green. And how many butterflies and bees used to fly around. But they're not here anymore. And you would really, really like to show them to that child that you're with. You would like to show the beauty of these bees flying around and the butterflies that used to be here. And you also notice the silence in that forest. There's no birds singing. So all the insects that they used to feed on, they're gone. And so the birds have gone a few years ago. So maybe you walk back to a car, a vehicle that you're going to drive in, because you still have to go shopping to buy some food. And you start driving. And once you drive across many, many greenhouses. And they actually only grow food in greenhouses nowadays, because the fields are too dry to grow food in the ways we normally used to do 30 years ago. Because there's too few water. And while you're on the way to the supermarket, you're turning on the radio and you hear about politicians discussing whether we should build a wall around Europe to prevent people from other countries coming, because they have no resources, they have no food, they have no water, and they want to come to Europe. And they're discussing whether to either let them drown in the Mediterranean or maybe shoot them at the borders, or just leave them be in front of the wall. I mean, there's no food there anyway, so they're probably not going to come. But these people are coming. And they're very desperate. They have nowhere else to go. And maybe think about how your society reacts to all these people who have a reason they are coming. Maybe there's big discussions. Maybe there's violence in the streets. People attacking each other on these different opinions that they have. And maybe while you're driving along that street, listening to the news, that kid sitting next to you, you get a call. It's a friend of yours. And he's telling you that one of their relatives got dengue fever. We are in Western Europe and they have dengue fever. What are you going to tell that friend? So we've seen there's many challenging situations facing us in the future, and maybe that's enough for now. So you can imagine just walking back on that lifetime that you've envisioned before, to the very moment now, here and now. And just feel the surface that you're sitting on, how your weight is sinking into the chair. Feel the feelings in your body and the sensation of breathing. Focus on the breath flowing through your nostrils, here and now in this very moment in 2020. And once you're ready, you can open your eyes and start moving a little. Maybe stretch, or get up and actually clap your body a little to wake up, to refocus of being here in this very moment. And I would really much appreciate if you were to maybe share some of the feelings that occurred when imagining all this. You could either open your mic and say something if you like to, or you could write it in the chat. Chris,
hi.
How are you feeling?
I just opened. I forgot to turn off my video, and I just opened my eyes when you were talking about these political discussions of shooting people at the border. Come on, I mean, like, we're already having that. Not really as a discussion, but we're already having politicians who openly say that, and and I don't know. I'm getting very angry and frustrated and stuff, and I really wanted to stop that exercise, which is not because it was bad, but because, yeah, I got like too emotional about it. I don't think we need to stop recording the sessions. It was asked in the chat, but
maybe we can just stop recording for a few minutes and then start recording again when we return to the input.
People want to share something.
Yes.
So
can we do that?
I thought I was unsure if you were trying to make me get anxiety on purpose. No, because I started to feel also very anxious. But I had some conflicting feelings because, like Chris said, I think we already face a lot of these situations now. in my opinion, and I didn't really know how to differentiate between whether to follow in these feelings of anxiety over 30 years. So it was very confusing, feelings of anxiety on different time levels and scales. Yeah.
I will just share on a very personal level. That's a question that I'm asking myself too. Like, should I really go into that feeling, or should I better not? And I don't really have an answer to that. Somebody says, I felt basically what I feel every day in 2020. It's more or less the same as I just said: helplessness, anger, fear, grief, and frustration. Thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you. And of course, it's challenging to go into these feelings because they're inconvenient. We don't like having them. Which is why I have a huge respect for you actually doing this with us. All right. I think we can leave it to that and keep on going. So what we've just seen is it can be kind of hard to dive into these feelings. And I think that one of the core messages that we have for you today is that it's kind of normal to have these feelings, because when we actually are willing to dive into what climate change really means, that's how we feel. And the challenge kind of is to find the balance between dysfunctional ways of avoiding these feelings by kind of, I don't know, denying that there's climate change at all, or kind of giving up into doomism and saying, well, I don't care, I can't do anything at all, and we're fucked anyway, so I'm just going to give up. And on the other hand, like feeling utter panic and not being able to sleep anymore, worrying 10 hours a day, being hyper aroused, so never actually being able to relax and calm and enjoy life and the beauty it still has nowadays. So kind of finding the balance, the functional scale of experiencing emotions in the intensity, in the duration, and the frequency of these feelings. That is something that is the high art of how to deal with any kind of emotions, which is not just about climate change related emotions, but any kind of feelings that we have. So how do we do that? How can we be more resilient with feelings and with climate change? So, Chris, tell us something about resilience.
Yeah, like resilience. Basically, the definition of resilience here is what you can read. But I basically like the idea. In my point of view, it was presented by Antonovsky in the first place. I don't know if that information is correct, Kat, but Antonovsky, who brought up the model of salutogenesis, which would be the questions why. Yeah, there is research on the topic. Okay, I don't understand the question. pH, general pH. Okay, I don't understand the question. Maybe you can specify it more. So resilience in Antonovsky's point of view, he used this metaphor of like we are in a I'm lacking vocabulary here, Fluss, like in a river, and the river, and in that metaphor he said that the river is polluted, and this he means both metaphorical and he means it very concrete, like the river is polluted. And the question is, how do we become a good swimmer anyway, because we cannot come out of it. So I like that metaphor for resilience very much. So how can we cope? How can we grow through our trouble, and how can we transcend adversity? And we will present to you now some strategies about that. And
actually, Chris.
Oh no!
Talking about rivers, there's actually different metaphors with rivers about resilience, and I know this is improvised now.
I love it.
But like normal concepts of resilience in the research that we had for many years about resilience actually is that kind of finding the factors, also the biopsychosocial factors, that make us kind of a rock in the waves, who make us strong, withstand every force that comes and we are challenged with. But like more modern concepts of resilience are more kind of an adaptive flexibility of facing the challenges that are out there, and that would be more being the water of the river. So whatever rocks there are, you're kind of flowing around them and being more flexible and adaptive to whatever comes there. I just felt that maybe that image helps. So now we're going to talk about climate resilience.
So we should keep the shortcut because we're kind of lacking on time. We have kind of 2 minutes for every point. So we're going to speed up this a little, not talk too much about it. And maybe if you want to ask questions or report something personal about it, that would be basically much more lively. And I think we keep the recording on, so be aware of that. So Kat, start with point 1. What can we do to improve our self-care?
Yes. So self-care, which is kind of helping us with our individual resilience, coping with feelings and with climate change. Point 1, very cognitive behavioral, having a good structure. So a good daily routine of self-care, which would mean sleeping enough, eating enough. So very basic things. That's the foundation, I would say. And also having a good work-life balance. So having enough time to relax, do something that has nothing to do with stress and climate change, and just allowing yourself to be happy every now and then. That really helps. Having good leisure time activities, being creative, meeting friends, whatever helps.
Basically, it's obviously a good thing to also know what is a good leisure time for you or something. Let's jump to point 2, because I think people will not say so much about structure, but social context. And basically this point should also be called social context and social competencies. So of course it's good to have friends, and as Katharina said earlier on, your friends can be a huge resource, but your friends can also be, I wanted to say, a pain in the ass. I hope that's fine to use that kind of language in this context. But yeah, I mean, especially when you care about climate change, we get into these discussions and stuff. And maybe it's a good idea to know with whom not to have these discussions. But maybe it's also at some point good to know who are your friends and maybe who are not. Social competencies definitely means the ability to say no, maybe even the ability to say no in a way that doesn't make you lose all your friends, but in a way that is kind of nice, or at least not super aggressive. We could talk about nonviolent communication here. I don't know if you know what this is or if it's a thing wherever you are, but it's basically a very good idea to look that up. We could do a 10 units talk about nonviolent communication and still not master this, but just look it up. So are we going to next point, or do you want to report something about I don't know, your experiences with social contacts?
I guess we can do that.
But sorry, later people, and hi people that are actually here. So feel free to share anything. The recording has stopped. So let's continue.
Yes. Simple things. This is, I would